you for coming to tonight's crowd conversation, which is our regular speaker series focused on building a circular construction economy in New York State. I'm Gretchen Worth. I'm the project director of the Susan Christopherson Center for Community Planning, which helps New York State communities plan for a more equitable, climate-resilient built environment. The Christopherson Center is one of the founding partners of CROWD, which stands for Circularity, Reuse, and Zero Waste Development, and we're the organizer of Crowd Conversations. So tonight's presentation, Students in the Crowd, is our last for the season as we will take a break for the summer. We'll be hearing from 3 Cornell students who've been involved with CROWD's work, Shivani Isola, Kai Foti, and Annie Stewart. Before we get to their introductions, we have a big announcement and a couple of housekeeping details. So our big announcement is that we'd like to congratulate the City of Auburn on its passage last week of a deconstruction resolution, which was voted on unanimously by City Council members. This is a non-binding resolution that signals the city's commitment to working to deconstruct rather than demolish its buildings and to divert those materials from the waste stream to benefit the community. We believe that Auburn is the first New York State municipality to pass any type of deconstruction resolution or ordinance, and we applaud them for setting an example. We hope many others will follow soon. Now to the housekeeping details. We will keep the conversation to an hour, including the Q&A. So please type your questions in the chat as we go along, and we'll get to those at the end. And please keep yourselves muted so everyone else can hear the presentations. As I mentioned, this is the last crowd conversation of the season, and we will be back in October with more great speakers. So stay tuned for the fall lineup. You can register to receive crowd updates at crowd.org, crowd with a 0 for zero waste development, if you're not already signed up. So we have people joining us tonight from across New York State and beyond, but I'm based in Ithaca. So I would like to acknowledge that Ithaca is on the traditional homelands of the Guy-Cahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Guy-Cahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Ithaca, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Guy-Cahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Guy-Cahono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Our first speaker of the evening, Shivani Isola, will receive her Master of Regional Planning degree later this month. Shivani is a dancer working at the intersection of community and regenerative practice. Shivani's work has allowed her to advocate for refugees with the United Nations High Commission, teach digital filmmaking to underserved youth in South India, and implement sustainable projects combating homelessness in her hometown of Los Angeles. Shivani has a BA in politics and a BA in Italian literature from the University of California, Santa Cruz, as well as certification in Renaissance art and architecture at the Università degli Studi di Firenze. She's a student of natural building and regenerative farming and has facilitated workshops on creative confidence, decolonizing travel, and repurposing food waste as art materials. Shivani is sharing her exit project, The Dilemma of Debris, a grounded analysis of construction and demolition waste in Bangalore. After Shivani, Kai Foti and Annie Stewart will present Where Buildings Go to Die, a story map of New York State waste sites. This is a project that was conceived and developed by another CROWD student who graduated last year, Emil Bensidrine. Because of the challenges inherent in gathering and analyzing data from the Department of Environmental Conservation, Kai and Annie have taken Emil's great work and gotten the story map over the finish line. Kai is an urban and regional studies major who's graduating later this month. Growing up in New York City, Kai was fascinated by the city's massive transportation system. When he was 10, he moved from Brooklyn to Staten Island, and the difference between the 2 boroughs was like night and day, with Staten Island being very car-centric. He spent much of his high school years on transit forums discussing how to improve transit on Staten Island, including making a mock redesigned bus network for the Bureau. He is passionate about improving transportation throughout the country, which includes advocating for more environmentally friendly forms of transportation. Kai has used his GIS skills to collaborate on a number of projects at the Christopherson Center, including CROWD's Waste Facilities Map that you'll learn about shortly. Annie Stewart is from Nashville, Tennessee, and finishing up her junior year as an environmental engineering major at Cornell. Annie is passionate about environmental protection and Indigenous rights. In the future, she hopes to work on creating equal access to clean water and healthy environmental surroundings for all people. Through her work at the Christofferson Center, Annie has become interested in circular economy development through collaborating with communities on policies that support climate resilience in the built environment and workforce development. Annie's work on behalf of Crowd over the past 3 years has been extensive, and there's no time to mention all the ways that Annie has contributed. She's researched deconstruction policies and incentives in different municipalities throughout North America, which supported the creation of the local deconstruction guide and many other Crowd resources. She's also interviewed New York State residents engaging in deconstruction for a new guide to be published this summer. And she's worked to gather data on vacant schools and on waste facilities, as you'll learn in a bit. And before we start, I also want to thank and acknowledge Galiba Anjum, also a Christofferson Center intern, who has been providing technical assistance and expertise for all of our monthly conversations. And we would not be able to do this without all of Galiba's hard work. So thank you to all 4 of you. And Shivani, we will kick it over to you to get us started, and I will stop.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Gretchen. Let's see here. Can we see this all right? And you can hear me. Fantastic. And Gretchen, about 20 minutes, so we have time for questions. And yeah, okay, fantastic. And feel free to cut me off if you need to. But hi, hello everyone. As Gretchen mentioned, I'm Shivani Lakshmi Isola, and I'm really excited to share my research with you today. It's the working title is The Dilemma of Debris. It's a grounded analysis of construction and demolition waste in Bangalore. And my faculty advisor for this project is Nima Kudva here in CRP. So a little bit about what we're going to be going over today is just, sort of, oh, I don't know if you guys can see these controls, can you? No, okay, fantastic. You just see the presentation. Okay, it's looking a little funny on my end, so I'm just going to minimize everything. All right, forget about that. So why construction and demolition waste? This is the question of the hour. So as maybe most of us know, but if you don't, if you're new to this type of research, I think you'd be interested to find out that the construction industry is responsible for more than 50% of all of the raw material that is extracted globally. And of that, construction and demolition waste make up about 35% of what you see in global landfills. So this is a huge issue. Of that, about 44 billion tons of non-metallic construction materials, and this is your sand, clay, gravel, all of that were extracted worldwide in 2017, and it's only, been exacerbated. And here's the fun part. Resource use is projected to double, actually, from 2017 to 2060. So going back for a second, if we were, at 44 billion tons of natural resources in 2017, you can imagine how much that'll be in the next 30 years or so. Okay, here's just some quick facts. So we've got, in the United States, 600 million tons of CDW, that's construction and demolition waste, were generated in 2018. That's twice the amount of all the other municipal solid waste. So everything that, your households and offices are sending to landfills, this is actually doubled, just CDW alone. China has 1 billion tons of CDW. They only are able to recycle 5% of that. And then India also has 300 million tons, and only 1% of that is recycled. So that's sort of the issue that we're dealing with. Focusing in on India for a second, construction is India's second largest industry. And given the growth of the country, about 70 to 80% of the India of 2030 is yet to be built. So why Bangalore? Well, Bangalore, which is officially Bengaluru in Kannada, which is a language that they speak in the Indian state of Karnataka. It's India's 3rd largest city, and it's home to 8 million people. It's 11 million people if you include the entire sort of metropolitan boundaries. And it's interesting to note, it's sort of self-stylized as India's Silicon Valley. It's also one of the fastest growing metropolises, not just in Asia, but also the world. And it had a GDP, just the city alone, of $110 billion a couple years ago in 2022. Here's the fun part. All this growth leads to waste invariably, and about 3,000 tons of construction and demolition waste are generated every single day in Bangalore, and that's about 250 truckloads of material. So my research questions really around this project, it was multifold. It just, was curious who's generating this waste, where does it come from, where does it end up, what types of materials are being thrown away, what's recycled, what's not, when did this become a problem, where do we go from here? I also was particularly interested in the role of informal waste labor, which we'll get to later at the end of this presentation. But really the all-encompassing question was, what is the ecosystem of construction and demolition waste in Bangalore? So I did a little bit of initial mapping before I left for my fieldwork, kind of just to see where the current population is and where new construction is happening. And so you can see new construction is just here in these red stars. And this is just data that I had to, find and put together to make it make sense, to make maps out of it, because that data really doesn't exist anywhere. And then here I kind of compare, same thing, sort of population growth with these construction sites. It's also the location of some of the CD waste processing sites here in purple to try to get some sense of where the overlaps are. So using that framework, I kind of developed an idea around this ecosystem of construction and demolition waste, right? So I figured it starts with construction, it goes into demolition, then you have reuse and then design. Really at the center of this is policy. So that's sort of the framework that I was working with. Then I got into the field. So I was in India, in Bangalore, for about 2 months last summer in 2023. And kind of see immediately just the construction and demolition waste everywhere, right? All these images I took within the first week of arriving, and it's just kind of overwhelming, and it's not just the scale. Sometimes you have small pieces as well. And this picture on the right is particularly interesting because this was at the BBMP, which is sort of the main governmental headquarters of Bangalore. And I actually was there at the offices to meet with their solid waste management officials. And, the calls coming from inside the house, they have their own construction demolition waste problems as well. So I knew I had a lot of work to do. So jumping into construction and design, I interviewed 3 architects and 7 civil and environmental engineers who are actively designing to mitigate CDW. And then something interesting to note, because it's kind of a little bit different from how maybe things work in other cities, but in Bangalore, the construction of all buildings over 4 stories do need to be approved by the director of planning. So you can kind of start to see where maybe the control lies. And so this is a really interesting project called Windmills of Your Mind from Total Environments, which is an architecture firm based out of Bangalore. And Shibani Sagar is the principal architect there. She sort of walked me through how they integrate waste into their project. So here you can see broken brick pavers on the right that were used as tiling throughout the property. You have another type of stone called Kota stone that was also broken and was then repurposed as sort of a design element in one of the living rooms. You have more brick here on the left that was used really to quite nice effect to kind of frame this bedroom here. And then here on the right, this headboard is actually a piece of vintage wood that was actually hand carved by an artisan friend of theirs to make this headboard here. So that's kind of a more heritage material approach. Another architectural solution is called the Atelier, which is from another Bangalore-based firm called Biome. And so here, their client was actually a nonprofit school, and their issue was quite interesting because they didn't own the land that they wanted to build the school on. They were only able to lease it for 5 years. So they came to Biome and said, hey, we need something really modular and essentially that could be taken apart and moved elsewhere in case our lease is up when we have to move it. And so they were concurrently working on another retrofitting and demolition project. It was just like a private home. So they were able to kind of repurpose materials from one project to the other. So this is really interesting because everything that you see is actually completely modular. So all of these tiles can be removed, both the ceiling and the floor tilings as well. All of these pipes that are essentially holding up the frame here were used a special kind of welding called tucka dot welding, where instead of welding the entire piece of metal to each other, they actually did tucka, 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 so dots of welding, so that, you know, in 5 or 10 years' time, you have the same tensile strength and integrity of the material, but you don't have to cut huge pipes in half. You can actually just sort of bang it with the hammer and they'll be able to be reused all over again. So I thought that was a really innovative approach to material reuse. Here's another view here. You can see all of these cardboard partitions, also modular, can be reused. And have the next slide. Okay, great. This takes us into demolition and reuse. So these are some quotes from Akbar, one of the demolishers that I was lucky enough to interview. So this is, you know, he kind of goes into like the fiscal realities of his work. So just some key takeaways that you guys might find interesting, that the average distance between a demolition site to the recycling center is 15 kilometers. And they need to charge about $90 per truck in order to sort of recoup gasoline, labor, all of that. There always is some sort of depreciation because he cannot extract 100% of any recycled value. And I think this is a really important takeaway as well, the quote at the end there where it's like, I need to think about traffic, I need to think about daylight. So these are kind of the, you know, issues that demolishers are facing with, the realities of their industry. This is Iqbal Ji and I last August at the largest demolition site in Bangalore. And he works, Iqbal Ji and Akbar Ji, whose quote was in the previous slide, they all work above board. They're, you know, licensed businessmen and things like that. And so I got a lot of intel from them and sort of like how the formalized demolition economy works. And so it's been really interesting to see how the labor market has really changed in their field. So in the past, demolishers could sell old bricks for 50 paisa each, which is about 100 rupees. That comes out to $1.20 of profit. But, you know, 20 years ago, wages for daily laborers were between 6 to 24 cents, and now they're $8 to $12. So that's a huge exponential increase. And what this means is that rising labor costs lead to a more mechanized demolition process. And so you can see this in the back. There's quite a few, sorry, what's the word? There's quite a few large vehicles that are being used in this process versus, you know, 20 years ago, it was a lot more hand-done demolition. So the main challenges for demolishers really are the rising labor costs, but they also have the cost of recycling after demolition. So for example, Akbar Ji is taking all of this waste each day to the recycler, which is about 15 kilometers away from this site. And then he has to pay for it to be processed there. So not only is he paying for the gas and for his workers, but he also is paying for the recycling as well. This doesn't include the wear and tear on their vehicles. At the same time, they're not able to drive their trucks through the city between 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. A lot of constraints here. The good thing about recycling is in heritage materials. And so a lot of the architects that I talked to we're talking about, these are, you know, columns that are 300 years old. On the left here, this is a door that's also similarly vintage. And then, you know, a beautiful chandelier on the right as well. And so what happens with great heritage materials like this is demolishers tend to have relationships with architects, and they'll just call them up and say, hey, I have, you know, this great material. Are you interested? If that doesn't work out, then they do take them to other friends that have sort of warehouses for heritage materials. So that's sort of the one avenue for this type of, you know, really beautiful material. But other than that, there's very few places for it to go. So this leads us into industrial scale recycling. key here is the Yellowhunka Landfill and Rock Crystal Processing Center. So on paper, this is the largest landfill in Bangor, and Rock Crystal is the only licensed construction and demolition waste processing center in the city. So this is the landfill. This actually doesn't smell terrible. I think it's important to note. They do put down plastic sort of at the end of every day, and they spray perfumes and fragrances as well too, to sort of like mitigate the scent. But you can see it's an old quarry here. So this goes down, you know, just miles and miles and miles. And this was last summer. And so it's probably, you know, halfway filled up more than this now. And this should be decommissioned, this site that you're specifically looking at here, later this year. It'll be filled up with waste. So now that takes us into Rock Crystal, which is also, so this is just over the wall that we just saw prior. And this is the only place for construction and demolition waste recycling in the city. And so you can see different types of quarry dust and things of that nature. I'm going to skip through to the next slide. Oh, just kidding. No, I'm not. Let's see. Oh, yeah, there we go. So here you can see here, you've got, you know, bricks that aren't being pulverized and other types of concrete pylons in the back. So these will get reused just as is. If they don't fit to those standards, they actually will get crushed into 3 different sizes here using these machines, which are specialty made and are specifically for construction and demolition waste. So you can see you've got 3 sort of outputs here of varying fineness. And so the finest one, like in the middle, for example, that's really used to as a conduit for flyaways and pathways and things like that. It's just like an infill material. And then you have other sizes like 5 millimeters and 10 millimeters that are used to either lay down foundations for buildings and sort of increasing tensile needs. These are some, oh shoot. These are some workers that were at the site. Sorry, it's not staying for some reason. But it was interesting to note sort of the role of, oh gosh, of labor in this process. And so those folks there are scrap metal recyclers. Let's see if the slide will stay. Okay, well, I'll show you one guy. So they're scrap metal recyclers. So they actually come and remove any type of metal, iron, aluminum, what have you, and they resell them to the Indian waste economy is very hierarchical, and so they're at the lowest rungs. So they'll sell any metal that they find to sort of the person who's the next highest rung, who's then aggregating all that metal and then selling it to a wholesaler. And so it sort of goes up the chain that way. Okay. Small scale recycling. So we saw that's industrial. This is small scale. So there's an organization called Sahas that is an aggregator of waste, because the industrial scale recycling that we just saw has minimums, right, of what they'll take on. So Sahas really works with household waste. So if you have, you know, if you're renovating a room in your house, for example, they'll collect the waste. And as you can see, they're sort of segregating the materials themselves, right? But they don't have a lot of space really that they work with. This is just their office. And as you can see, they receive 30 to 35 calls a month, but they can only accept 30% of those calls. And that's because the waste is mixed, it's not segregated by material, and the location is too far. So we're starting to see like the same issues again. It's, you know, all about location and then the non-segregation of material. Illegal dumping, our favorite topic. So this is, I feel very lucky, I guess, weirdly, to have caught this on video, but here I was actually going to visit a number of lakes that I was told people were dumping construction and demolition waste in. And you can see, you know, I've just pulled up to the waste here and, to the lake here, and this man is just dumping his entire truckload of construction and demolition waste. And so I asked him, you know, what's going on here? Where did he get this material from? And they were building a apartment building just down the road, and his boss told him to come here and dump it. This is another lake that's just next to the one that we saw the dumping at. And here you can see, this lake is in much better condition. It's got a sign and a gate and all of that, but it's facing the same sort of issues as neglected lakes as well. This is a fascinating example here. So you see the lake on the right, and then the demolition debris from a 20-story building here on the left. And you can actually see that the waste is so much, it's starting to kind of like bring down the fence there. And it's important to note that Bangalore is a huge stopover for migratory birds as they're sort of traversing the subcontinent. And so if they want to stop here on this lake, for example, they're also subjecting themselves to all this waste because it's flying over, it's landing in the lake, it's sort of all these, ecological considerations that maybe aren't apparent immediately. Here's another view here. And, I love this one because you can kind of see how much waste we're actually dealing with. 20-story building sort of sounds abstract, but when you see it compared to an actual building, it starts to, I think the severity of the problem really speaks for itself here. So this was a really interesting finding for me as well, is kind of the connection between the lakes, the urban lakes in Bangalore, and the construction of the metro. And also, again, the call is coming from inside the house. Here in orange, those circles represent sites where community members have reported dumping by municipal employees. And you can kind of see a correlation between where the metro is being constructed and where government employees are dumping. And there is, some overlap with the location of water supply valves and urban lakes. Some surprises, and I'll sort of like roll through these, was retrofitting and upcycling. When I started this research, I really was focused on a construction and demolition binary. And I totally didn't realize, retrofitting and upcycling. And so I got to go to this great upcycling, transforming workplaces. I was the only non-industry person at this conference. And, I heard from architects, developers, clients, and people who are like innovating in the materials space. And this was, again, really important for me because it doubled down on the fact that it's so much easier to segregate waste when it's for retrofit projects. And so again, like the role of informality, and if you study India, it's informality is like it's the main driver behind the economy, really. Some estimate that it's 90% of the Indian economy is sort of informal. And so what that means is you have large informal waste economies. So plastics, metals, glass, all types of items are sold through a very hierarchical system of recycle and reuse. That's not the case for construction and demolition waste. So we talked a little bit about the metal recyclers, right? And sort of the heritage materials, but concrete and cement makes up 30 to 40% of all construction and demolition waste. And it's not being recycled formally, right? Those plants are only operating at 10% capacity, but it's not being recycled informally either. So this is a man, he is an immigrant from northern India and actually came to Bangalore and is working as an informal waste laborer. And I asked him, and all the informal waste laborers that I talked to, no one deals with concrete, right? Even the organizations that are working in waste labor, no one is dealing with concrete because it's too heavy and it has no resale value. So that was, again, really interesting, where you have a culture of such strong informal waste economies and no one is dealing with this material. So this, you guys are going to love this. So Katra Mane, which translates to trash house in Kannada, is the brainchild of G.V. Dasararthi, who's an engineer. He has nothing to do with design. This is what his house looks like. And it's 100% made from recycled material. This is GV here in his living room, and you can see the windows, the bookshelves, everything is from reclaimed wood. Oh, these photos are not showing. Okay, so here, for example, they've turned the emissions from the stove. The soot is actually, they've just turned it into a design feature. So what they did here is, instead of plastering the walls with like a 2-inch coat of plaster that might be standard on, for example, like the wall behind me, they did a very thin layer of plaster. And so it has all of these natural crags and valleys and recesses that the soot from the kitchen below is actually settling into. And they just leaned into it, made it into a design element. And if you didn't really know what you were looking at, you would have no idea that that's actually just, you know, soil, essentially. Oh, these photos are not working. Oh no. Oh gosh. Well, I have a bunch of photos here, but they don't seem to be populating really. Oh gosh. Well, that's unfortunate. This is another example of like innovating with material. This is a company called Hedrad that actually has a female founder and CEO, which I think is huge, not just in construction, but you know, in the sort of materials industry space, especially in India. Hedrad is amazing because they actually have developed a material, a wall material, a building material that has a honeycomb structure on the inside. So it's incredibly light and durable, but it's also transposable. So these walls can be taken apart and reused up to 3 times. And they work with industrial partners. So they have partners that have used this material for their factories. And as their factories have had to expand or shrink for whatever economic considerations, they've been able to actually, you know, modulate the building as well. So that's pretty fantastic. Some key takeaways here. So we remember this from before. This was sort of like the framework that I was working with for this like ecosystem of construction and demolition waste. This is sort of where we've ended up. As you can see, it's a lot more complicated. It's not just construction and demolition. You have environment and retrofitting, obviously, as part of that. Informality, reimagining of like space and material. Geography is also so key, like where is construction happening? Where is demolition happening? Where are the recycling centers in relation to all of that? What's the role of industry? What's the role of homeowners, landowners, clients? And it's not just policy, it's really like political economy, right? And culture and all of that. And this is my thesis topic. So I've written about 70, 80 pages on this. And a large part of it, I do make this case that like the IT industry and its boom in Bangalore, which has led to its financial success, has actually also led to, you know, these real issues of waste as well. And this is really evident in the people that I've interviewed. As you can, you know, see here, they really run the gamut of disciplines. And so, yeah, I wanted to say thank you, especially to Gretchen. I was an intern at the Christopherson Center my first semester here at Cornell, and I was doing deconstruction policy work, and it was fascinating. And I just sort of kept running with it, and it was able to kind of develop this project out of it and do a lot of really, you know, life-changing, interesting work. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to her and to Reps and Einaudi and Cornell for funding the project. That's all I've got. I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, fantastic. And then we have time for questions after Annie and Kai, but I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thanks, Shivani. Thank you. That's fascinating. I have so many questions, and I think probably others do as well. And we'll get to those after Annie and Kai's presentation. So Annie and Kai, take it away.
Okay, I'm going to now. That's great. Hello. Our presentation is on our works with the story map that we're currently working on, which is named Will Buildings Go to Die, and it is a story map showing all the waste facilities in New York State and what the future plans are regarding those waste facilities.
Yeah, and Gretchen already introduced us, but just to say hi again, I'm Annie, and I'm an environmental engineering student at Cornell. I've been a Susan Christopherson Center project assistant for the past 3 years now.
And also, I'm Kai, and even though I was also introduced earlier, I am, just wanted to state, I'm a senior in open and regional studies, so I will be graduating in a few weeks. And I have been a project assistant, for this semester, so since January.
Yeah, and so just for a bit of background to those new to CDD, or C&D debris, so 600 million tons of building waste is generated each year from the construction and demolition of buildings and infrastructure, and 90% of this waste is from demolition. However, 80% of it could be reused or recycled, which shows a huge missed opportunity for reuse. In New York State specifically, 18.4 million tons of C&D debris is created annually, representing 46% of the total waste stream. So that's a huge portion of it. And this shows the importance of working towards transforming from a linear building and construction economy to a circular one. And so the goal for this story map is to better understand size and material flows of CDD to more accurately quantify this waste stream in New York State. And so for where CDD can go, it can't just go to any landfill. It can only go to facilities registered or permitted by the DEC, which is the Department of Environmental Conservation in New York State. And so the first kind of facility is transfer stations, where materials are received, consolidated, sorted, and transported to be processed, treated, or disposed of. Processing facilities, which intake uncontaminated CDD generated from demolition, land clearing, etc. And then landfills are the last stop in CDD's journey. After a building or piece of infrastructure is demolished, material will then decay and is no longer valuable and can't be reused. And then finally, municipal combustion facilities or incinerators are where material production can become from combustion or waste to energy. And this is often marketed as sustainable. However, there's still a large amount of greenhouse gas production from it, so it's really not. And it's also important to note that there are no geographic requirements for where CDD goes, and some of it, 10%, is actually exported outside of New York State. Next slide. And so for how we gathered our data for this story map, we got it from individual annual reports through the DEC open source data. The data is frustratingly often difficult to find, constantly changing, contradictory, and often outdated. And as you can see an example, this is the first page of an annual report for a C&D landfill. And so someone fills it out. Sometimes it's handwritten and hard to read. Sometimes they put the wrong information in or like forget to fill out a section. And so for each data point, we had to individually go into one of these reports and find it ourselves. So this shows the importance of the need for modernized and more stringent data collection requirements, as it really makes it difficult to accurately quantify where CDD goes. Next slide. Oh, you're muted, Kai.
So one of the things that we needed to do for the story map is map out all of these different facilities. So what we did is we used ArcGIS Pro in order to map out the transfer stations, processing facilities, landfills, and the combustion sites. And we organized them in a way that also shows it's an interactive map. So like it also shows like a lot of information based on these sites. You just scroll over to a site, it'll tell you what it is and all the key information that you need to know about the site, which also includes the expiration date. So here is the final story map. And this is what's on the site. you could just scroll over to a specific dot, and it would give you information on what exactly it is. We have several maps throughout the story map, so it's not only this map. So, we have like the main background map, which shows everything, and then we have maps that go into specific facilities like landfills, transfer stations, processing facilities, etc. And when you click, and this is the information to the right that you would typically get when you scroll over the story map. So just show you some key information about it. Just a little update on, well, just a little background on how many of these facilities we have. Since there are a lot of facilities, especially transfer stations and processing facilities. However, we do, given that we are focusing on the ones that accept CDD, the story map is primarily showing the ones that accept CDD. So we have 500, we have over 500 transfer stations. We have 900 processing facilities in general. And we are confirming this with the DEC. But we have gotten anywhere from 230 to over 500 processing facilities that accept CDD. We also have 141 landfills in New York State, however, only 10 accept CDD, while an additional 25 accepts CDD as well as our waste. So there's a total of 35 landfills that deal with CDD waste. Finally, we have 10 combustion sites throughout the state, and 4 of those combustion sites accept CDD.
And then for why this data is important to have, as I said before, it allows for a better understanding of the size and material flows of CDD. And you can also see what regions in New York State are more burdened with this waste. And we actually know that regions 5 and 6 have the least recycling or diversion rate of CDD, and they have the most landfilled, so those landfills are more burdened with it. And then one data point that is included in this is closing dates. And these are important because as the dates get closer for the permits, the question arises of where the waste will now go. And if no CDD is diverted, new facilities will have to be created or existing ones expanded. And it's also been shown in communities that live around these facilities, there's been pushback in terms of extending the dates. So they have longer until they would close because there's things like it decreases the land price around these facilities, especially landfills. You have things like smell, you have public health issues. And a lot of like upstate New York is feeling burdened with this. And also exportation out of state could also increase. Right now it's 10% is exported, but if there isn't increased diversion rates, that number could increase. And so this just all emphasizes the need for policy from the state government and local governments for support to divert these materials from landfills and continue reuse and recycling. And the story map will be available for full access in the coming weeks once we're going to confirm our data with the DEC, especially that one point on the processing facilities where there's 2 different numbers that have been found, and which is slightly frustrating. So we're going to confirm which one is correct. And then when that's verified, there will be access on crowd.org to the story map. And next slide.
We just wanted to give our special thanks to Emil, Galiba, and Gretchen, given that they did help support us with this project and with Crowd in general. We also wanted to give our thanks to Kathleen, Foster, and Ka Wong of New York State DEC for the time for providing like the data of these processing facilities and just helping us in general. Also, just wanted to give credit to the DEC, given that they have the they have like the open source data that allowed us to make these maps in the story map. Also the New York State solid waste management plan, as well as the Environmental Protection Agency as key credits.
Yeah, and that's it from us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Annie and Kai. Thank you, Shivani. Both of those were fabulous. I have questions. There's questions also coming through in the chat. But before we get to those, I just wanted to invite Emil Benson-Dreen, who was the original, who did the original story map and which Annie and Kai have built on, to unmute and say hi and just talk a little about his original motivation for doing that. Emil, are you able to talk to us for a moment?
Yeah, I can speak really quickly. I'm technically still on the clock. But it was so great to see you all present. And I just, I mean, the original motivation, of course, is like, we need the data, we need to know, you know, we need to just be able to visualize this giant industry that we're trying to tackle and transform and change. If, you know, and without being able to do that, we can't do anything. And I think really I'd like just an extra big shout out again to like Annie and Galiba, who like peeled through those crazy reports, sometimes handwritten. And I just like really admire the just like the diligence and the, just like the effort that must have gone into that work. And so just like a extra big shout out to them again. And yeah, I'm excited to see it go live and see what it can do.
Thank you. And thanks for getting it started, because I know it was a lot of work on your part before you graduated and left for your job. So thank you.
Yeah, it was so fun to, you know, to go through the data and really like see the picture jump out, and to now see it finished is great. And it was great to also have you as a mentor. Well,
thank you. So just for everyone who's interested in the story map, we are finishing this up with our colleagues at DEC, who Annie and Kai mentioned. And so we're hoping to have that on the crowd site by the end of the month. And so, as has been mentioned, it's an interactive map. Anyone is able to go in and get information on the different sites around the state. And we will endeavor to update it fairly regularly with DEC data as they update their data on waste facilities. So with that, please continue to type your questions into the chat, but I'm going to go through some of these right now. So Annie and Kai, where and why is CDD exported out of state? And do you know where it's going when it leaves New York State?
Yeah, so there's unfortunately not a lot of data on this overall, but the main reason it would be exported be because it's cheaper, and then maybe in the surrounding area of where the CDD is generated, there isn't a lot of capacity in that landfill, or maybe like the nearest site that accepts CDD is out of state. In terms of where, I would say just like the surrounding states. There isn't like available data on which ones specifically do the most. You might know that, Gretchen. But the 10% is like the main number that we have for the amount of CDD that is exported out of state.
I believe that it's divided among Ohio, Pennsylvania, and then a southern state, perhaps Virginia or Tennessee.
Okay, so it is far away. Yeah.
If you're interested, the DEC's 10-year solid waste management plan does have some information about that in its appendices. Shivani, question for you. Approximately how much time, money, and people did it take to complete that cute house built with 100% recycled material?
Thanks. Yeah, I wish I could, I had great photos actually to share from that, but I think they sort of got buried in the presentation there. In terms of time, it was about the same amount of time. So I talked to both the homeowner and the architects behind the project. And money, it was considerably less. Like, for example, all of the fixtures in the house were repurposed, right? So he had really high quality, like toilets, for example, and really high quality stoves. And GB mentions, for example, like the stove would have cost him, I don't know, like let's say $200 US, and he ended up paying like equivalent of like $50 US, right? And so in terms of like total money, I think I would have to like figure that out based on sort of I haven't added everything up, right? And then in terms of people, much less people as well. So GV was doing all of like the sourcing himself. So he was actually he didn't have like, any people that he was working with to source these materials. So he was going to demolition sites himself. He was going to like the resale markets himself and things like that. So he was really, so involved with all of the projects, or, every step of the project that I think it brought down like the total labor cost as well, because he was doing so much of it. Yeah, but about comparable level of time, significantly less money, and significantly less people as well. Thanks for the question.
Question for Annie and Kai. What does CDD stand for, and what are your recommendations to address these issues that you raised?
Well, CDD stands for construction and demolition debris, which is basically what happens when when like a building gets demolished due to like whatever reason. For example, in College Town, a lot of buildings are being demolished for bigger apartment complexes. A lot of like that, like debris is basically was considered CDD waste, and that is what we're planning on getting people to like reuse that waste into a lot of like different like structures or formalities, etc.
Yeah, and I would add on to that in terms of like what are the recommendations to address these issues. From what we've found, having policy incentives, for example, there can be incentives to permits to get faster demolition permits. If you say you're going to divert some of that waste or to deconstruct it, there can be tax incentives. But ultimately, like the biggest thing you can do is to have a policy support from the local governments and the state government to do these to either divert this waste or for deconstruction. Which, did I explain what deconstruction is?
Go for it.
Okay, so basically deconstruction is instead of demolishing, you take apart the pieces. It's usually a lot more, less machines are used because you need it to be taken apart, and then you can use that for reuse, so it doesn't go into the landfill. It isn't pulverized or anything like that, and then you can reuse it on other construction projects such as like timber. A lot of wood is used, bricks, stuff like that.
I have a question for Shivani. So in terms of what you saw in Bangalore, in knowing the challenges that the US faces around the circular construction economy and New York State specifically, are there some recommendations or things that stood out to you? And so, for instance, I was really taken with with the story about how the demolishers, when they spot valuable things, will actually reach out to architects who they know are incorporating this into their work. That might be one example, but are there other things that were happening that made you think like, we should be doing that in New York and the US?
That's a really good question. It's funny, I didn't really consider the relationship between the architect and the demolisher to be a good thing because it's informal, right? And if like that relationship didn't exist, or if the demolisher didn't know that, there were architects out there interested in this material, then it does end up getting wasted, right? So that just felt like a kind of like a thing that's happening, but maybe it's not a recommendation, right? I think my recommendation for that would really to be like to formalize it, or to like have a place where heritage materials go, right? Almost like a library or like an online database. That's like a preservationist's dream, right? I think in terms of what else, I mean, I really was expecting a lot more of like informality in the waste management process, right? I really thought that like you would have strong like resale markets for like concrete waste or what have you. I didn't see that, but there were a lot of other resale markets. Like for example, GD was getting so much of his used toilets and things like that from just like Sunday markets and places like that. So I think if there was more kind of like, you know, reuse centers, but that were less, I don't know, I think there's a disconnect, you know, between like where the waste is coming from and how it's actually being resold. So I don't know if the solution is to have like more reuse centers or just to make it easier for people to buy materials. Like maybe there's, you know, like a house is coming down and they're deconstructing it. And so local construction companies just come through, like it's like an open house for materials, right? Which is kind of what's happening in India. When there's like a demolition about to be scheduled and the architects will come and get their materials and other people will come and sort of get the metal and all of that. But maybe if that sort of existed, but that's a really good question. I haven't really thought about like broader lessons, right? But okay, thank you. Now I'm adding this to my thesis. Thank you. What are broader learnings? That's good. Yeah.
Okay. And for Annie and Kai, I'm just curious as you were parsing through the data, and Annie was kind of going blind with all of the annual reports, but for both of you, when you started to dig into things, what surprised you most?
That's a good question. I'm trying to think about, I think like the actual quantity of it was quite surprising. And I know like because we looked at it originally, especially with the processors, just the amount of them and like the landfills too, and the difference, like how many of them are privately owned versus publicly owned. I think just like the intricacies of all of it was something I hadn't been anticipating. And it kind of explains a lot of why this kind of waste is so hard to quantify with everything going into it, if that makes sense.
Same. I would also have to agree with that, especially given the transfer stations and like the processing facilities where there was like over like 500 for each of them, with several of them accepting CDD. I was also kind of found it interesting how there's like a lot more of those compared to something like landfills, given the fact that like landfills, whenever I think about like waste, and like where waste goes, the first thing that comes to my mind is a landfill and not a combustion facility, not a processing facility, not a transfer station. So it's interesting to see that there's like a lot more transfer stations and combustion facilities compared to landfills, especially ones that accept CDD.
Well, thank you all so much. We're right at 6 o'clock, so we will end for today. But Shivani, Annie, Kai, Emil, if you're still there, fabulous work. Really, really great to work with all of you. And thank you so much for sharing all of your research and all of your hard work with everyone tonight. Just as a reminder, the story map will be on the crowd site, hopefully by the end of May. And please sign up for fall crowd conversations. We will get that lineup out this summer and hope to see you all then when we kick that off in the fall. So thanks again for joining and have a good evening. Bye-bye.